Bronze Age is known for its great empires and powers, which flourished in the Near East up until the infamous Late Bronze Age collapse. Many of these are well known: the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Mycenaean Greeks with their great palaces, and the ever-mighty Egyptians. However, there was another, far less well-known civilization which rose to prominence in the mid-2nd millennium BC, even becoming the pre-eminent power in the Near East under their most powerful kings: the Hittites. Until the 19th century, the Hittites were effectively a lost civilization, their first archaeological evidence being old Assyrian trade records which detailed dealings with a certain land of Hatti. Previously, the Hittites were only known from scant mentions in the Hebrew Bible. However, the discovery of increasing numbers of cuneiform tablets, texts in an unknown language, tantalized scholars. It was the rediscovery of the Hittite capital of Hattusa and the excavations which have taken place there since 1907, which have slowly revealed more and more about this elusive civilization. The picture that emerged from excavations and inquiries into the Hittites has revealed a complex and advanced civilization. Well versed in the art of war, the Hittites and their mighty charioteers established an empire which stretched across Anatolia and southwards into Syria. Their artisans and metalworkers produced beautiful and intricate works. They had established legal codes, were adept at statecraft, and worshipped a dizzying array of gods and goddesses. In order to better understand this unknown and fascinating people, we will explore their society and culture and attempt to answer the question: who were the Hittites? The origins of the Hittites themselves are somewhat unclear. As no king lists survive, we are reliant on the written sources of other ancient Near Eastern civilizations in order to build an image of the early Hittites, and any dating we have is, by its very nature, approximate. Our very earliest glimpses of the Hittites come to us from the Assyrians at the advent of the 2nd millennium BC. The Assyrians came to the region seeking the valuable gold and silver which was to be found in Anatolia in rich reserves. They did not, however, come to Anatolia as conquerors, intending to extract these metals from the earth themselves. Instead, they came as traders. For, at the advent of the 2nd millennium BC, Anatolia was covered in a varied patchwork of city-states, forming a number of small polities and kingdoms. It was with these city-states that the Assyrians traded, bringing tin, the key ingredient in the creation of bronze, in return for gold and silver. In addition to this, the Assyrians also brought with them a far greater and more enduring gift: writing in the form of the cuneiform script. It is old Assyrian cuneiform clay tablets extracted from Assyrian trading settlements in Anatolia, such as the settlement of Concise, which contain the earliest examples of the Hittite language, primarily in the form of names. The cuneiform script was in turn adopted across Anatolia and continued to be used long after the decline and disappearance of these Assyrian trading colonies. The Hittite population was formed of a number of ethnic groups, including Mesopotamians, Syrians, and a variety of Anatolian peoples like Hurrians and Hattians. It would appear that the major ethnicity in central Anatolia at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC was the Hattians, who were organized into a number of city-states. It was out of the antagonism between these city-states that the Hittite polity would emerge. The Anita text, thought to have been composed in the 18th century BC and considered as the oldest known text in the Hittite language, describes how Pithana, king of the city of Kusara, conquered the city of Carnes, or Nessa, as it was also known, which was incidentally also home to an Assyrian trading colony, making it his capital. His son, Anita, conquered and apparently destroyed the city of Hattusa, which would go on to become the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire. The first true Hittite king is traditionally held to have been named Labana, a monarch who ruled over one of the small kingdoms in northern central Anatolia in the early to mid-17th century BC. According to the Telepinu proclamation, an edict written later, Labana conquered the land surrounding Hattusa, absorbing several neighbouring kingdoms into his new realm. As the proclamation notes, On whatever campaign he went, he held the lands of the enemy in subjection to his might. Perhaps reigning from around 1680 until the year 1650 BC, so influential was Labarna's rule that later Hittite kings used his name as an honorific title, in much the same way that Roman emperors were referred to as Caesar, in order to evoke the prestige of Julius and Augustus. Similarly, Labarna's wife, Tawananna, gave her name to the title of later Hittite queens. Upon the death of Labarna, his successor, who was perhaps a nephew of Queen Tawananna, assumed the throne. Hattusili I made the important decision to move the capital of his burgeoning kingdom from Kusara to the previously ruined Hattusa. Exactly why such a decision was made is debated. However, what is certain is that Hattusa had distinct geographical advantages for a warrior king. The city was located on a rocky outcrop, which provided excellent natural defences. 7 springs ensured a plentiful water supply, and the surrounding forest furnished the city with abundant timber. His new capital established, Hattusili set out upon a series of conquests which enlarged his territory and established the Hittite polity as a major force in the region. Campaigns against the kingdom of Yamhad in Syria extended the borders of the Old Kingdom to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the rich port city of Al-Alak. Hattusili also conducted a series of campaigns against polities in western Anatolia, in lands known as Arzawa, and against the Hurrians to the southeast, as both these groups took the chance to raid Hittite territory whilst Hattusili's forces were abroad. At the end of his reign, the Hittite king left a powerful realm. Hattusili selected his grandson Mursili as his successor, having banished his son and son-in-law for leading revolts against him, and his nephew for plotting. The incredible document known as the Testament of Hattusili records the final words of the king, in which he appointed his grandson as his heir. Upon reaching adulthood, Mursili displayed the same martial prowess as his grandfather, embarking on an ambitious and highly successful campaign down the Euphrates River, which saw the Hittite army sack both Aleppo and Babylon, causing the collapse of the old Babylonian Empire. Despite achieving outrageous success abroad, trouble was brewing in Hattusa. With the king and his army absent for so long, civil strife began to ferment, and upon his return to the capital, King Mursili was assassinated by his brother-in-law Hantili, who rapidly assumed the throne. Assassinations and power struggles would become a feature of Hittite politics for almost a century from the reign of Hantili. Hantili's successor, Zidanta, murdered all remnants of his predecessor's family before being assassinated by his own son, Amuna. Amuna's sons were, in turn, murdered by his short-lived successor, Huzziya I. During this near century of upheaval, civil intrigue effectively prevented Hittite monarchs from campaigning abroad. What is more, the relative weakness of the Hittites allowed the Hurrians to establish themselves as a regional power, one that would regularly conduct extensive raiding into Hittite territory. Around the year 1525 BC, a Hittite monarch intent upon reversing the rot wrested control from Huzziya in an apparently bloodless coup. His name was Telepinu, a regnal name unique amongst the Hittite kings, and perhaps chosen because it was shared with an agricultural deity associated with battling against chaos. In the first instance, Telepinu campaigned against the resurgent Hurrians, apparently succeeding in securing an alliance with the Kizzuwatna kingdom against the Mitanni further southeast. Even more crucially, Telepinu sought to end the ceaseless bloodletting that occurred upon royal successions and established laws of succession in the Hittite kingdom. The firstborn son of the king's first wife was to take the throne upon the ruler's death. If there was no son born of the first wife, then the throne was to be given to the son of one of his concubines. In the case of no male issue at all, then the husband of one of the king's daughters was to be adopted into the family and rule as king. Despite these actions, Telepinu's reforms appear to have been in vain. He himself died without an heir, his son having been murdered. The decades following Telepinu's rule, known as the Middle Kingdom, are characterized by the weakness of the Hittite realm, as bloody succession battles continued unabated, and neighbouring peoples took advantage by launching regular raids. In particular, the Kaskians, a non-Indo-European people who dwelt in the mountainous regions along the southern shores of the Black Sea. This period of malaise was only ended by a series of proactive military-minded kings, whose reign ushered in the period known as the New Kingdom at the end of the 15th century BC. However, things would get significantly worse before they would get better, and the resurgent Hittite Empire was forged in battle against the numerous enemies that beset the rulers of Hattusa. We shall return to the historical narrative later. For now, we will examine the society and culture of the Hittites. The monarch sat at the head of Hittite society, both in a civil and religious sense. Hittite kings were deemed to be the divinely appointed representatives of the gods on earth, and were high priests responsible for maintaining the relationship between the human and the divine. Upon death, monarchs were typically deified, joining the pantheon of gods in eternity. The administration of civic affairs was largely in the hands of a chief official known as the Hazanu, who oversaw the key functions of civic order, water access, sanitation, and fire safety. This may seem a strange function, but it was a crucial one in a society whose cities were primarily constructed of flammable wood and mud brick houses. Assisting the Hazanu were two senior officials known as the Maskim, and a host of officials, sentries, and heralds. In the provinces, district governors known as Bel Madgalti were charged with maintaining order and dispensing justice in the name of the monarch. Hittite law survives in the series of law codes, which are notable for their use of compensatory as opposed to retaliatory justice. Unlike the earlier Babylonian law codes, which dictated that a man who broke the bones of another must therefore have his own bones broken as punishment, the Hittite laws instead required that the offending party offer financial compensation to their victim. The death penalty appears to have been very rarely prescribed, and mainly for sex crimes. Trials were typically held at city gates, with the swearing of oaths undertaken by all participants, and judgments dispensed by regional governors. However, the king remained at the head of the legal system, and all Hittite citizens had the right to appeal to the monarch against any judgments made against them. Although most of what we know about the Hittites comes from artworks or inscriptions commissioned by the rich or by royalty, and is therefore primarily concerned with elites, we can infer some things about the average Hittite from artistic depictions. Although relatively sparse, male figures are usually shown wearing short-sleeved tunics which end above the knee, and women wear long mantles. Linen or wool would have been the most common materials used, whilst leather was used for belts and other fastenings. Both men and women are shown wearing jewellery, in particular hooped earrings, and distinctive pointed shoes with an upward curling toe section. Men are most often depicted as clean-shaven. Whilst apparently considered the lesser gender, women and femininity were very much revered in Hittite religion, with goddesses responsible for the growing of grain, for birth and creation of life. The representatives of the goddesses were, for the most part, women. Female religious practitioners, known as Hasa'uwa, or wise women, performed rituals involving recitation. Childbearing was an expectation for Hittite women, and priests or wise women attended births where ritual incantations were chanted throughout. Hittite women participated fully in commercial and agricultural life, working as labourers, cooks, musicians, weavers, and innkeepers. The very lowest rung of Hittite society was comprised of slaves, primarily consisting of prisoners taken in war, although it was possible for a person to become enslaved as punishment for particularly serious crimes, such as murder. For example, a murderer may be condemned to become a slave to the family of his victim. Whilst the master theoretically had total power over his slaves, they were a valuable asset, and as such would be unlikely to suffer mutilation or death at the hands of their owners. Interestingly, Hittite slaves were not totally devoid of rights. They were able to own and accumulate property, purchase their freedom, and were even liable for reduced fines in Hittite law codes. Slaves were often given their own allotments in addition to having to work their master's land, thereby giving them an interest in increasing productivity. It appears that wealthy slaves were even able to marry free-born women. The woman would remain free in such a marriage whilst retaining her social status, and any of the children of the union would also be free-born. It may not surprise you to learn that the Hittite economy was primarily agricultural. The majority of the population was engaged in subsistence farming, often on a series of small plots of land which were passed down within families. Hittite cooking appears to have mostly taken the form of various kinds of stews and soups. Meat was too expensive for everyday consumption, except by the wealthy. Viticulture was important too, although consumption of wine was primarily a preserve of the elite or upper classes. This being the Mediterranean, olive oil was of course incredibly important, and was used both in everyday cooking and in a ritual context for anointing and as an offering. Animal husbandry too was perennial. Sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, horses, cattle, and poultry were all kept in order to provide food and clothing, namely wool and leather. Bees were also kept for honey and wax. A pastry recipe, recorded in cuneiform, was made by combining flour and honey with either animal fat, butter, or oil, and then baked. Aside from agriculture, Hittite craftsmen were responsible for producing a variety of artistic works, including ceramic, stone carving, and metalworking, as we shall see in more detail in the section of this video covering art. Copper, bronze, silver, gold, iron, and lead could all be produced in Anatolia, and Mesopotamian demand for metal products likely led to an increase in exports to this region. Craftsmen customarily apprenticed their children, with trades generally passing from father to son. Trade too was important for the Hittites. It must have been a relatively lucrative element of the Hittite economy, as evidenced by the legal protections afforded to merchants. The penalties imposed for the theft of goods were harsher if the goods in question happened to belong to a trader. Hittite control of cities positioned on major trade routes, in particular those of Carchemish and Aleppo, allowed the Hittites to levy tolls on passing traders, growing rich off the flow of goods coming and going from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world. Military action was also a major source of cash for the Hittites. Conquests brought not only loot to the royal coffers in Hattusa, but vassalized states provided regular tribute. However, the waging of war is a notoriously expensive business, and the Hittites were no exception to this rule. A relative lack of manpower in Hittite territory meant that reserves would need to be called up from the general population in times of war, redirecting resources from food production. Warfare was a key element of Hittite society. Regular campaigning was undertaken outside of the winter months, and martial prowess was highly prized by the Hittites. Indeed, Hittite monarchs were the commanders-in-chief of the kingdom's armies, and many a king established and consolidated his rule through successful campaigning. In the words of Bryce, fighting one's enemies was as regular and natural an activity amongst the Hittites as cultivating the soil and worshipping the gods. War, not peace, was the normal state of affairs. The vast majority of Hittite armies were comprised of infantry soldiers, usually equipped with a sword and a spear, although some sources depict warriors armed with battle axes or even maces. Although only making up a small portion of the army, the Hittites were most renowned for their charioteers, elite shock troops who were used by Hittite commanders to break enemy formations, inspiring fear and destroying the resolve of opponents. Chariots generally consisted of a wooden frame covered with stretched animal hides. This lightweight construction made Hittite charioteers lightning fast and highly maneuverable. The key to the Hittites' successful use of chariots stems from their unique modifications to the vehicle. Whilst other Near Eastern peoples used chariots with the axle mounted at the rear of the vehicle, the Hittites built their chariots with the axle in the centre, a step which increased stability, allowing each chariot to carry a passenger who would wield a spear and a bow. Intriguingly, the oldest equestrian training manual in the world, found at Hattusa and attributed to a Hittite named Kikuli, describes an in-depth 214-day regime to train chariot horses, including dietary stipulations, training schedules, and even nocturnal practice exercises to ensure the effectiveness of the horses in battle. The king customarily accompanied the army on campaign and would often appoint members of the royal family as commanders, particularly if a war was being fought on multiple fronts and required the splitting of Hittite forces. The prestigious title of Goldstein, meaning chief of the wine, a position which grew out of the duty of royal cupbearer, was often bestowed upon Hittite princes. The Goldstein was charged with maintaining the nation's armies, and at times was required to lead armies on behalf of the king. Beneath the king and Goldstein, the regional governors, the Bel Madgalti, meaning Lord of the Watchtower, were responsible for maintaining outposts and garrisons on the borders of Hittite lands. Conquered lands, once subjugated, were made to sign treaties which acknowledged the Hittites as their overlords and promised to provide annual tribute. The Hittites also required their vassals to provide military support in times of war, and in return, the Hittites pledged to come to the aid of their vassals should they be attacked. Once such a treaty was signed, Hittite rule was relatively hands-off, with vassal rulers effectively ruling as they pleased. This system ensured that large numbers of Hittite troops would not need to be stationed in vassal states either, a crucial step as the Hittites were often lacking in manpower. As an aside, rather fascinating similarities have been drawn between Hittite treaties and the covenants formed between God and the Israelites in the Old Testament. It has been suggested that the Hittites, who are responsible for half of the treaties which survive from the ancient Near East, inspired the biblical authors of the Old Testament. The quality of Hittite art has been characterized as paling in comparison to equivalent works produced in Egypt and Mesopotamia. However, what it may lack in quality, it makes up for in its originality. For although Hittite art displays influences and inspirations from contemporaneous neighbouring civilizations, as arguably all art does, it is blended with a distinctive Hittite flair, which makes it genuinely unique. The majority of Hittite artistic works are concerned with religious themes, and it appears that unlike other Near Eastern rulers, Hittite kings did not commission stone carvers to render monumental works commemorating their military victories. Pottery was an artistic medium practiced extensively by the Hittites. The vast majority of these pieces are somewhat plain and functional in form, decorated with simple lines which were either carved into the clay or painted onto the surface, with some notable exceptions. Decorative ceramic cups formed in the style of various animals, such as bulls, lions, boars, eagles, and rams, and even the distinctive curled Hattian boot, and a number of highly decorative old Hittite vessels were discovered at the sites Inandik, Bitik, and Hussein Dede. One of the most spectacular amongst these is the Anandik vase, which features a staggering 50 figures, rendered in intricate detail in 4 layers or rings, depicting the stages involved in a wedding ceremony. On the lowest, a banquet scene is shown, with musicians and 2 prominent figures facing each other, likely a royal or divine couple. The next layer displays a god seated in front of an altar, with a procession moving towards a bull-shaped cult statue. The next, a procession, led by swordsmen, walking towards a temple and an altar. The final depicts a procession of dancers and musicians, ending in 2 figures engaged in intercourse. More intricate still is the inside of the lip of the vessel. 4 inward-facing bull's heads with hollow mouths connected by tubes to a small rectangular basin. When liquid is poured into this basin, it would travel down the tubes and out of the bull's mouths into the vessel. It is easy to imagine how such a vessel could be used in a ritualistic sense, with the blood of sacrificed cattle pouring out of the clay bull's heads. We know from depictions of people in Hittite art that jewellery was commonly worn by both men and women, particularly hooped earrings, although very few examples of personal jewellery have been found. That said, 2 notable gold amulets from the 14th to 13th centuries BC have been discovered. Both amulets depict deities. One, a male warrior deity, with horned conical headgear and bearing a mace. The other, a female goddess, seated upon a throne with a child on her lap and a large disc-shaped headdress, which has led to her identification as Arena, the sun goddess. Beyond imagery of the divine, Hittite art often concerned itself with depictions of animals, both wild and domesticated. The image of the deer or stag is perhaps the most common, a well-known motif in Anatolian art which stretches back beyond just the Hittites. Pre-Hittite bronze standards found in tombs at Alochahoyuk feature deer, and Hittite art is rich with images of these animals. The Karasu relief, carved into a rock above the Karasu River, shows an antlered stag being ridden by a male figure, most likely a god. Surviving cuneiform tablets give us tantalizing descriptions of artworks that do not survive. Gold and silver statues of stags, wrought by craftsmen for use in religious festivals. Other wild animals are also common themes of Hittite art. lions and eagles, associated closely with royalty, were rendered in stone, both on a small scale, such as with the orthostat from Alachahoyuk depicting a lion hunt, and the enormous monumental gateways at that same site, and at the capital of Hattusa. Stone lions and eagles, prized for their fierceness and speed, offered spiritual protection. By placing such monuments at the gates of the city, the Hittites intended to protect their settlements from misfortune or military attack. The double-headed eagle icon, found at a gateway at Alachahoyuk, was an emblem later used by the Byzantine emperors. Perhaps the most elaborate Hittite artistic works which are extant today are a number of decorative drinking cups, created from silver during the 13th or 14th centuries BC, referred to in Hittite texts as bibru. One such vessel, rendered in the form of a stag, was sent as a gift to the Egyptian pharaoh by the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. So elaborate is this cup that the fine silver surface even features a complex relief of a religious ceremony, wrapping around the body of the stag near the lip of the cup, an outstanding example of Hittite artistry. Hittite religion, like many ancient Near Eastern religions, revolved around the worship of a large number of deities. The gods were revered and feared in equal measure, their whims personified into the forces of the natural world on which human survival depended. Satisfying the gods through prayer and sacrifice was essential to life, prosperity, and military victory. The Hittites, like other ancient polytheistic peoples, regularly adopted the gods and goddesses of other peoples into their own pantheon, whether they were the deities of neighbouring civilizations or peoples conquered by the Hittites and absorbed into their empire. In some cases, syncretism was utilised, and the new deities were merged with an equivalent Hittite divinity in order to assimilate them into the pantheon. However, more often, the Hittites appear to have adopted new gods and goddesses wholesale, and apparently in very large numbers. A prayer composed by King Muwatalli names 140 separate gods, the vast majority of them being local variations of the storm god. This accumulative approach to the divines appears to reflect, in the words of Stone, a mentality of safeguarding the state from facing the displeasure of some forgotten deity. The risk of disaster that would occur from failing to observe any given deity was simply too great. It was far safer to cover all bases, as it were, and pray to all the gods. In a similar vein, upon conquering a new territory, the Hittites would customarily carry off the cult statues of the local deities, bringing them back to Hattusa to be revered. Physically retaining the cult statues of foreign gods in Hittite lands also prevented said gods from assisting the Hittites' enemies, and secured the prosperity of the Hittite state. The adoption of deities by the Hittites meant that their religion was heavily influenced by the religious beliefs of other civilizations, both that of neighbouring peoples and of their predecessors in Anatolia, the Hattians and Hurrians. One particular text, preserved in tablet and known as the Kingship in Heaven, is a good example of this. It tells a Hittite version of the creation myth concerning the Hurrian father of the gods, Kumarbi, in which Kumarbi overthrows his father, the sky god Anu. In return, Kumarbi is overthrown by his son, the storm god Teshub, and ultimately defeated by his offspring, in a narrative which has been compared to the Greek creation myths relayed by Hesiod. In particular, both stories contain the specific and rather bizarre image of new gods issuing forth from the castrated genitals of their forebears. Of course, in the Greek tale, it is the storm god Zeus who overthrows his father Kronos, establishing his place at the head of the pantheon. The Aegean influence on Hittite religion is clear to see, as many other texts, such as the Song of Silver and the Song of Ulikumi, bear striking resemblances to Greek mythology. Like the Greeks, the gods of the Hittites were fickle divinities, whose absence from and intervention in the human world decided the fates of mortals. Greatest among the Hittite pantheon was the storm god and sun goddess. Although referred to by different regional names, this divine couple were often named as Teshub and Hebat, although the Hittites also referred to them as Tarhuna and Arena. The rulers of heaven, it was upon Teshub and Hebat that all of humanity depended. Teshub, head of the pantheon and the weather god, marshalled storms, bringing rain to the earth. It was the heat of the sun, sent by Hebat, that provided the warmth crucial for the cultivation of crops. The kings and queens of the Hittites were the mortal representatives of these divine rulers, couple in imitation of the divine. Beneath the storm god and sun goddess were a panoply of deities assigned to every aspect of society and who oversaw all aspects of daily life. Teshub's daughter, Inara, divine huntress, was responsible for the wild animals of the world. Hasamili was the god of metalworkers and craftsmen, whose divine furnaces belched forth smokes capable of shrouding Hittite troops in a protective cloud. Hanahana was a mother goddess, closely associated with the hearth and childbirth. Istustaya and Papaya were underworld goddesses, who, like the three fates of Greek mythology, spun and cut the thread of mortal lives. All elements of the natural world had their attendant deities, as did the domestic sphere. There were gods of the hearth, of windows, and even of door bolts. Hittite texts describing religious rituals survive in large numbers. Rituals were carried out at all levels, from the simplest domestic offerings to grand set-piece state occasions, intended to secure good fortune in battle or verdant harvests. Sacrifice was the primary method for appeasing the gods. Sheep, goats, and cattle were led to the temple, accompanied by a procession of dancers and musicians, before being slaughtered and cooked into a stew by the priests. One text describes a kind of ritual sandwich being created. He then breaks 2 loaves of ordinary bread and places them on the table. He places the liver upon it. Wine, beer, honey, milk, and oil were also sacrificed. Sacrificial foods were either consumed by the worshippers or else burned. The blood of sacrificed animals was also used. Bread could be dipped in blood and offered to the altar, poured as a libation into pits, or, rather gruesomely, thrown over the temple walls and cult statue as a method of ritual cleansing. Regular festivals were a crucial feature of Hittite worship, with over 100 such celebrations taking place each year, varying hugely in form and function. However, most had some features in common: rituals involving bread, entertainments, and ritualized sport. In terms of entertainments, Hittite festivals involved dancing, singing, and procession, making use of harps, lyres, lutes, horns, and drums. Actors would perform for the public, and one festival even featured a temple official bathing naked in beer. Boxing, wrestling, and shot put, and weightlifting have all been noted as ritualized sports engaged in at Hittite religious festivals. Most intriguing of all is a sport described in cuneiform texts as cheese fighting. It is unclear if the cheese in question was being used as a combat weapon or as some sort of ball that the teams would try to score with. Prayer was also very important, and Hittite monarchs, as the religious leaders of their people, imposed numerous appeals to the gods. One such prayer, written by King Musili II, appealed to the gods to lift a plague from the Hittite Empire, lest the deities themselves go unworshipped. If the gods, my lords, do not remove the plague from Hatti, the makers of offering bread and libation pourers will keep on dying, and if they too die, the offering bread and libations will be cut off from the gods. The Hittite language was an Anatolian tongue and part of the Indo-European language family. Amongst the Indo-European languages, it is the language with the oldest surviving written evidence. Despite being the oldest, Hittite was discovered relatively late, as our knowledge of it comes primarily from around 30,000 cuneiform tablets excavated at the end of the 19th century at Hattusa, the Hittite capital, and other Hittite cities. It was only several decades later that Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný studied and deciphered the tablets from Hattusa, declaring in 1915 that Hittite was Indo-European. Linguist Edgar Sturtevant, noting consonantal differences, later hypothesized that Hittite, instead of being an Indo-European language, may actually be a sister language to Indo-European. He characterized this as Indo-Hittite. However, today it is generally agreed that Hittite was and is Indo-European, and that its quirks can be explained by the fact that the language is recorded far earlier than other Indo-European tongues, thereby retaining features that were lost in other, later recorded dialects. The period known as the New Kingdom began in the reign of King Tudhaliya II, perhaps around the year 1425 BC. Tudhaliya's was a rule punctuated by warfare, in particular war against the Azawa city-states in western Anatolia, such as Hapala, Wilusa, and Mira. Of special interest to scholars is the city-state of Wilusa, which is thought from sparse references in contemporary sources to have been the legendary city of Troy, sacked by the Achaeans in Homer's Iliad. Alone, these city-states weren't very powerful. However, in confederacy, they represented a severe threat to the Hittites, and it was such a confederacy of 22 states that Tudhaliya was able to defeat in battle. Once more, the Kaskians used the absence of Hittite forces to launch raids, before the king rushed homewards to drive them out. In addition to this, the victorious Tudhaliya campaigned against the Hurrians, raiding Mitanni cities and annexing the former buffer state of Kizzuwatna. However, despite these successes, the Hittites were apparently still beset by their hostile neighbours during the reign of Tudhaliya's successors. The Kaska to the north, the Azawa to the west, and the Hurrians to the east set upon raiding the Hittites with such ferocity that the capital of Hattusa was temporarily abandoned and relocated to Samuha. The pharaoh Amenhotep III, writing to one of the Azawan kings, stated that, "I have heard that everything is finished, and that the country Hattusa is paralysed." Yet it was not the end. From Samuha, slowly but surely, King Tudhaliya III, aided by his younger son Suppiluliuma, engaged in 2 decades of protracted conflict, gradually regaining the lost territories in Anatolia. Upon Tudhaliya's death, Suppiluliuma supplanted and murdered his older brother, gaining the throne with the support of the army which he had helped to successfully lead for many years. Suppiluliuma was a bold and resolute leader. Pushing his advantage, the new king focused upon the southwest, conquering Aleppo and Carchemish, installing his sons as viceroys, simultaneously vanquishing the Mitanni and leaving the Hittites as the premier political power in the region. Such was Suppiluliuma's influence that the widowed wife of Tutankhamun requested a marriage alliance with one of the Hittite king's sons. This alliance never came to fruition, as Suppiluliuma's son, Zananza, was murdered on his way to Egypt. Seemingly at the height of their power, the Hittites were struck by plague, a plague that would blight the empire for decades to come, and which ultimately killed King Suppiluliuma and his successor Arnuwanda II, the deadly bacterial disease known as tularemia. Despite this epidemic racking Hittite territory, Suppiluliuma's youngest son, Mersili II, enjoyed some limited military success, with his brothers Telepinu and Piasili ruling Aleppo and Carchemish as viceroys. The Hittite frontier in the east was secure against the imperial powers of the emerging Middle Assyrian Empire and the Egyptians, allowing Mersili to campaign against the Azawan states and the Kaskians. The war against the Azawans may contain the first known example of biological warfare, as the Hittites drove plague victims into enemy territory. The reign of Mersili's son and successor, Muwatalli II, saw regional disputes with the Egyptians and the Assyrians come to a head. This was perhaps signalled by the new king's decision to move the capital, shortly after his coronation, from Hattusa to Tarhuntassa in southern Anatolia. A curious act, but one which was perhaps designed to move the centre of Hittite power closer to disputed territories in Syria. Tensions with the Egyptians over the contested cities of Kadesh and Amuru, strategic strongholds located on the lucrative trade routes which stretched westwards from Mesopotamia, erupted into open conflict, which culminated in the 1274 BC Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh can perhaps be seen as the peak of Hittite martial might. A reported 47,500 Hittite troops, including over 3,000 chariots, led by Muwatalli and his brother Hattusili, confronted a large Egyptian force of the conquering pharaoh Ramesses II near Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River. Egyptian sources and monumental carvings record the course of the battle. Ramesses split his forces, sending 2 divisions ahead as a vanguard. Hittite spies succeeded in convincing the Egyptians that Muwatalli's forces were far away in Aleppo. It was when the Egyptians began to make camp after hearing this news that the Hittites, concealed on the far bank of the Orontes, struck, rapidly routing the Egyptian vanguard. Amazed at their success, and finding the Egyptian camp loaded with riches, the Hittites reportedly began to load their chariots with treasure. This gave the remainder of Ramesses' forces the chance to arrive and push back the jubilant Hittites. Matters thus having reached a deadlock, the Egyptians withdrew southwards, harried as far as Damascus by the Hittite army. Although the battle was tactically a draw, politically the Hittites came on top. They retained Kadesh and Amuru, even taking Damascus for a short time. It was some 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh, during the reign of Mu'tali's brother, Hattusili III, that a peace treaty was drawn up between the Egyptians and the Hittites. In the peace, each side agreed to honour the other's sovereignty. Borders were drawn up in the contested region of Syria, and the pharaohs and Hittite kings agreed to come to each other's defence if one of them was to be attacked. It also contained a standard clause in ancient peace treaties: the return of political opponents fleeing from one realm to another. Both Egyptian and Hittite copies of the treaty survive. The Egyptian version, which was sent to the Hittites, written in Akkadian, was carved into a silver tablet. A replica of this cuneiform tablet hangs today at the UN headquarters in New York. The peace treaty agreed with the Egyptians represents the height of Hittite power. They had established themselves as overlords of Anatolia, controlled the western sections of the Mesopotamian trade routes leading into the Mediterranean, and enjoyed a mutual defence pact with the pre-eminent power to the south, the Egyptians. However, it would be the rise of the Assyrians to the southeast that would lead to the slow decline and eventual demise of the once mighty Hittite Empire. Hattusili's son and successor, Tudhaliya IV, had barely time to rest on the laurels won by his father before he was visited by civil unrest, stirred up by the Achaeans of the Western Empire. Quashing this, Tudhaliya was faced by an even greater challenge: souring relations with the newly powerful Assyrians. Tukulti-Ninurta I, the new ruler of Assyria, aroused the ire of the Hittite king by invading Hurrian territories under Hittite hegemony, including Mitanni. In retaliation, Tudhaliya ordered a trade embargo, forbidding trade with the Assyrians, a move which erupted into full-scale conflict, culminating at the Battle Nerea, a battle which ended in an embarrassing defeat for Tudhaliya, whose vassals and allies appear to have abandoned him on the field. Despite these setbacks, the Hittites appear to have maintained suzerainty over their Syrian vassal states, such as Ugarit and Amuru, and even successfully managed to launch an invasion of Cyprus, which reduced the island to the status of a tributary for a time. It has been suggested that dwindling copper supplies in the Hittite heartlands precipitated such a bold maneuver. However, the decline had begun to set in, and despite Tudhaliya's successor, Suppiluliuma's staging of another successful campaign on Cyprus, the Assyrians made increasing territorial gains in Syria and Asia Minor at the expense of the Hittites. The Hittite army was stretched so thin that Suppiluliuma was effectively unable to maintain control of his own territory, let alone counter the encroachments of the Assyrians. A rival regime in Tarhuntassa, led by Tudhaliya IV's cousin, Kurunta, had designs on the throne, and to make matters worse, a series of devastating droughts caused widespread famine across Hittite lands. The situation was so bad that the pharaoh Meneptah sent emergency grain supplies to the Hittites. In this incredibly unstable political and economic atmosphere, the vassal system that maintained the Hittite state began to crumble. Vassal states, pushed to the brink of starvation by changing climate conditions, were unable to send supplies to Hattusa. In turn, the Hittite kings struggled to maintain any semblance of political unity. This combination of factors, internal upheaval, climate, and foreign invasions, spelt the end not just for the Hittites, but for a number of ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations in the early 12th century BC, in a period that has come to be known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Kassites of Babylonia, and the Hittite kingdom all collapsed, whilst the great powers of Egypt and Assyria were severely weakened. Widespread famine and invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, themselves likely refugees from the aforementioned economic hardship, broke these great powers. As Cline puts it, perhaps the inhabitants could have survived one disaster, such as an earthquake or drought, but they could not survive the combined effects of earthquake, drought, and invaders in rapid succession. The gradual disintegration of other powers made the Hittites' own decline worse, as they relied upon neighbouring states for the provision of certain goods through trade. The advance of the Sea Peoples down the Mediterranean coastline, en route to settling in Philistia, left the Hittites dangerously open to attack from their erstwhile enemies, the mountain-dwelling Kaskians. Hattusa itself, the great capital of the Hittites, was razed to the ground sometime around the year 1180 BC. Although the Hittite state may have collapsed, the influence of the Hittites and their culture endured, primarily in the form of a number of Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states which existed in Anatolia and Syria. Records for these realms are scarce. However, their material culture shows clear Hittite influences, including the use of traditional artistic motifs such as lions, imagery of the hunt and royalty, and the distinctive Hittite boot with curled toes. The greatest of these post-Hittite kingdoms, and perhaps the last to survive, was Karkemish, its patron deity, the Hittite goddess Gubaba. With the Neo-Hittite states in Anatolia having been conquered or subjugated by the conquering Neo-Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser around the year 1160 BC, the Syro-Hittite kingdoms became Neo-Assyrian vassals in the 9th century BC, and were finally incorporated into the empire at the very end of the 8th century. So it was that the Hittites, long after the fall of their kingdom, were fully absorbed by neighbouring civilizations. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.